Hello, my name is Cortland Burgess, and my presentation is over the self-care deficit theory of nursing created by theorist Dorothea Orem, one of America's foremost nursing theorists. Dorothea Orem was born in 1914 in Baltimore, Maryland. She passed away in 2007 at the age of 92. Orem was extremely accomplished and dedicated to the field of nursing, as you will discover as we add on to the timeline I created of Miss Orem's life. Unfortunately, I was unable to find much personal information on Miss Orem, but I did find some amazing accomplishments throughout her career. Miss Orem's educational background consists of her nursing career began in the early 1930s in Washington, D.C. at Providence Hospital School of Nursing. There she obtained a diploma of nursing. She went on to receive her Bachelor's of Science in Nursing Education in 1939 from Catholic University of America. She continued her education with Catholic University of America and completed her Master's of Science in Nursing Education in 1946. Nursing is the field of knowledge and practice. Nursing is a practical science where knowledge is developed for the purpose of work to be done. Ms. Orem felt that if nursing was to continue to advance in knowledge and practice, there was a need for a structured and organized body of nursing knowledge. The goal that stretched her life in nursing was to develop a theoretical structure to serve as an organizing framework for nursing knowledge. The question that propelled her creation of the theory what condition exists in a person when judgments are made that a nurse or nurses should be brought into the situation, or what is the condition that indicates that a person needs nursing care. This was the starting point for the creation of SCD&T. My interpretation of the question, at what point are patients lacking the ability or knowledge to care for themselves and therefore creating a care deficit? And Ms. Orem answered, the inability of a person to maintain on a continuous basis, their own care or the care of dependents. This began the gathering of knowledge of what individuals need to do or have done for them to maintain health and well-being. A need for assistance exists when the inability of persons to provide continuously for themselves the amount and quality of required self-care because of situations of personal health. I do feel that the purpose reflects understanding. Ms. Orem discovered a need, assessed where the need would be of benefit, and created a way to help. The theory was developed to provide a framework for nursing knowledge, which then created a framework for nurses to utilize their knowledge to identify and assist individuals who are experiencing a gap in personal knowledge and ability in the topic of self-care. And the theory Ms. Orem developed with the assistance of colleagues is the self-care deficit nursing theory. SCD&T. The text words the theory in two ways, but throughout the remainder of the presentation, I will utilize this acronym. Concepts are the building blocks of theories, and this theory is built with many blocks. From my understanding, there are 13 concepts and 4 underlying theories in this theory. The concepts seem to be broad in nature, and the majority are abstract. I feel that if a concept is abstract, it is also broad, due to the extent of possible interpretations and the level of imagination and understanding. There are a couple of concepts where the definition is more concrete, and they will probably be obvious to you once I begin to explain each concept, but I will point them out as well. The first underlying theory is theory of self-care. Self-care is deliberate actions engaged by a person for the purpose of promoting and maintaining life, health, and well-being. The act of self-care may also be performed by someone, the dependent agent, a future concept, for an individual who is not capable of performing for themselves. Factors that affect self-care are stages of growth and development, states of health, energy level, environmental factors. These factors also relate to the concept of basic conditioning factors, which is a more concrete concept that will be discussed further. The second underlying theory is theory of dependent care. This care is provided by the dependent care agency. Such dependency may be due to many factors such as age, lack of ability to perform self-care needed to maintain life, health, development, and well-being. The same ultimate goal of self-care, just a different agency is providing the care, the dependent care agency rather than the self-care agency. I know I'm linking some concepts early, but the relationship between the concepts are so strong that the definition of the concepts assists with the understanding of other concepts. The third underlying theory is theory of self-care deficit, a relationship between self-care demands, another concept, and the individual's ability to partake in self-care, an underlying theory, and Q, the nurse. This is where the assistance of nurses help individuals. The fourth and final underlying theory is theory of nursing systems, which is how the act of nursing is produced through relationships. Continual, consecutive, deliberate, practical actions of nurses performed in conjunction with individuals' actions to enhance recognition and meet self-care demands, along with protecting and developing an individual to develop their personal self-care agent. Self-care agency is a concept within the theory. I refer to the concept as self-care agent like the individual is the agent to their own self-care, which is the next concept. Self-care agency, a complex learned ability of persons growing in maturity to recognize and meet their continuous human function and developmental requirements through deliberate action. Deliberate action, actions performed by an individual with intention and conscious of intentions to bring about a condition or state that does not presently exist. Deliberate action is key within this theory. I feel that this may be due to the act of self-care being a learned concept, one in which someone must consciously and continuously partake in. To me, it makes sense to think of this concept as a self-care agent. An agent is someone who acts on behalf of another person. As a self-care agent, you must deliberately act on the care of yourself. My interpretation relates to how Orem identifies human beings in 5 views, one of them being an agent when participating in deliberate action. Another concept is self-care requisites, the reasons why self-care is taking place, the goal of self-care, or self-care requirements, and there are 3 types: universal, developmental, and health deviation. Universal self-care requisites are required goals to be met through self-care or dependent care, necessary for human structure and function, such as intake of air, food, and water, elimination of substances, balance of activity versus rest, and socializing and solitude, prevention of hazards, and recognizing human limitations as well as human desires. This concept seems more concrete. Developmental self-care requisites, promotion of development, engaging in self-development, conditions that prevent development. This concept seems more abstract. Self-development and the factors that promote it and prevent it differ for all. The third and final type of self-care requisites is health deviation self-care requisites. They exist in those who are ill or injured, those experiencing conditions or disorders, and those under medical diagnosis and treatment. When an individual development of a self-agent is impaired, either permanently or temporarily, affecting self-care. The intensity and extent of self-care or dependent care are compounded with increased number of health deviation requisites. Continuing on with the concepts that the SCD&T is built on, therapeutic self-care demand, the sum of care actions at a specific time or over a period of time required to meet self-care needs. Dependent care demand, the sum of care actions at a specific time or over a period of time required to meet an individual's self-care needs. This may sound like the definition we just learned about, but the second half is key. When the individual's self-care agency or agent is insufficient in doing so, resulting in dependency. Dependent care agency, the ability of an individual to recognize and meet the therapeutic self-care demand of another person who is dependent in care and or promote development in the dependent person's self-care agent, where nurses come in. Self-care deficit, relationships between therapeutic self-care demands and the abilities of the self-care agency, where the abilities within the self-care agent are lacking in recognizing and meeting some or all components of the self-care demand. The demand of self-care needs is greater than the supply of self-care ability. Dependent care deficit, when the dependent care agent is insufficient to meet the therapeutic self-care demand of the dependent person. The dependent care agent acts as the self-care agent for the dependent person and carries the same deliberate action responsibility as an independent individual self-care agent. The dependent individual demand is greater than the dependent care agency supply. Nursing agency, Persons empowered through the education of nursing knowledge and ability to function as nurses and participate in relationships, to recognize and assist others to meet their own therapeutic self-care demands, and develop and live as a self-care agent. Nursing agency not only helps develop self-care agency, but also dependent care agency as they provide self-care to individuals. Nursing design. Action taken before and after nursing diagnosis, utilizing knowledge, practical judgments, and concrete situational elements to create operational structure, with the goal of creating a framework for nursing practice. Helping methods. Series of actions taken by nurses to compensate for the limitations of individuals and/or their dependents. Such actions are doing for others, guiding, directing, providing support, teaching, and maintaining a healthy growth environment. The final concept is basic conditioning factors, conditions that affect the self-care demand and self-care agent. The self-care demand is dependent on the stage of life cycle, and the self-care agent is dependent on the stage of life cycle as well. Such factors are age, gender, developmental state, state of health, living patterns, healthcare system, family system, socio-cultural lifestyle, resources, and external environment. These are concrete concepts. These concrete factors affect the abstract concepts of self-care agency and demand. Relational statements propose relationships between and among two or more concepts. Theoretical statements link the concepts that build a theory. I feel that there are many relationships that exist within this theory. They all seem to encompass at least one of the four underlying theories. Here are the relationships I discovered within this theory. Self-care is related to the self-care agent. If the self-care agent is the self-care agent capable of providing self-care to promote function and development? Self-care is related to self-care demands. The task of self-care creates many demands. Self-care agency is related to self-care demands. Is the individual as the agent capable of meeting the demands present of self-care, and if not, a self-care deficit exists? Nursing agency is related to self-care agency as they strive to promote, instill, and empower the development of the self-care agent to provide self-care. Nursing agency is related to self-care demands as they may need to meet the self-care demands of an individual. Nursing agency must discover the deficit and provide the insight to the individual. If the individual was aware of the deficit, and the deficit technically should not exist, unless the individual is knowingly allowing the deficit in care. I feel that the relationships demonstrate understanding by describing and explaining their fellow concepts. The relationship between self-care and self-care agent and self-care demands appear obvious. The self-care agent is responsible to provide self-care and recognize the demands. The relationship between the nursing agency and the ultimate goal of self-care seems to be an implied relationship to me. The relationship between the nursing agency and the self-care agency does affect the self-care demands by developing the individual as a self-care agent who may then recognize their own demands. The nursing agent discovers an individual's self-care demands, which may then strengthen the individual as a self-care agent. The concepts of the theory are all interconnected, but the links may not be as direct. While this theory is built on many different concepts, as discussed earlier, I feel that the ultimate relationship of relationships within the theory does connect all the concepts, because all the concepts exist and have purpose because of one another. Self-care is provided by the self-care agent, based on the self-care demands. The lack of self-care creates a deficit where the nursing agency must become involved and enlighten and educate the self-care agency to recognize self-care demands to provide sufficient self-care. This chart is located on page 249 in our Alligood textbook. I do not feel like there is a hierarchy within the relationships. The relationships do appear to be directional in that they function as a cycle. The direction does not appear to be linear, but rather the concepts seem to relate to each other in a circle. The direction seems to relate most to sufficient condition. One variable or concept may lead to another, but it is not the only variable or concept that may cause the result. For instance, self-care agency may relate to self-care, but so does self-care demand. And self-care agency or nursing agency or dependent care agency all operate with the purpose of self-care being the final result. I feel that understanding the cycle of relationships only strengthens the meaning of the theory. Displaying the relationships between concepts, I feel the relationships do give insight and predictions. If an individual is not functioning as a mature self-care agent, the relationship between self-care demands will be hindered, leading to the need of a relationship with a nurse agency. The previous chart I showed displays the theory as a conceptual framework for nursing. This model is the basic nursing systems from Orem's text, Nursing, Concepts of Practice, located on page 244 in our Alligood textbook. Displaying nursing action in a wholly compensatory system, where the nurse provides all dependent care, or a partly compensatory system where the patient's actions are involved, or supportive education system where the patient is taking action and the nurse monitors the development of the patient's self-care agent. The textbook listed 5 assumptions that underlie the theory as human beings require continuous, deliberate inputs to themselves and their environments to remain alive and function in accordance with natural human endowments. Human agency, the power to act deliberately, is exercised in the form of care for self and others and identifying needs and making needed inputs. Mature human beings experience privations in the form of limitations for action and care for self and others involving making of life-sustaining and function-regulating inputs. Human agency is exercised in discovering, developing, and transmitting ways and means to identify needs and make inputs to self and others. Groups of human beings with structured relationships cluster tasks and allocate responsibilities for providing care to group members who experience privations for making required deliberate input to self and others. These assumptions seem to be derived from the many concepts that the theory is built on. Here I have highlighted words from each assumption that remind me of the context of the theory. For example, with the first assumption, the cycle of self-care shows that the relationship between self-care agency and self-care demands is continuous to lead to the self-care, and one must be deliberate in the cycle or a deficit will lead to the need of assistance. When breaking down the concepts of the theory to these 4 categories, I relate individual to self-care agency, being the independent individual responsible for deliberate care actions. Nurse to nurse agency, responsible to discover the deficit and provide assistance in discovering self-care deficit. Provide interventions to meet self-care demands both with the independent and the dependent persons. Environment to all areas, due to the theory being a general theory applying to all areas of nursing and self-care and functions of human beings. And health to self-care deficit and self-care demands, the 2 concepts that point directly the self-care which is needed for personal health. The Alligood textbook was amazing for this presentation. That is my reference, and thank you so much for listening.